Fable 3, the most hated Fable game, which also happens to be my favourite. Not because I'm being contrarian, as it makes me feel cool, no. It simply was the first Fable game that I played. At least a good decade ago now, whenever I used to visit my dad, we'd visit Game, and yes, the shop is just called Game, or somewhere like that, and pick up some pre-owned games for a 3 for £10 deal or something silly like that. My brother and I would choose some games based on how cool the covers looked, how interesting the game sounded, and then go to my dad or Nan's house and play them and find out which were good and which were wank. Fable 3 was one such game that we encountered in the wild this way. Don't worry, I would later go on to play Fable Anniversary and Fable 2. I love those games, but Fable 3 was my unorthodox introduction to a franchise that I now anticipate. With a new Fable in the works, probably still a couple of years off at least, I thought I'd go back and explore why Fable 3 was disliked. Actually critically think about a game I haven't actually done much thinking about, outside mindlessly making pies, shattering the in-game economy by purchasing the entire f***ing country, and launching chickens into the stratosphere because animal cruelty is integral to what makes Fable so special.
Stupid dog!
In order to do that genuinely, I've avoided doing what I've always avoided doing. Looking into why others dislike Fable 3 because I like it and I don't care what anyone says. This recent playthrough reinforced that, but I wanted to pick apart the game for myself and come to an understanding through my own experience as to why people might dislike this game, whilst also singing praises for the good qualities that I personally see in it. And I'm led to believe I'm not alone in that respect, but when I read the f***ing comments, why? Fun. I'm not entirely ignorant to every reason why others see Fable 3 as unfavourable. I wasn't even aware the Fable franchise existed until I saw Fable 3 on the pre-owned shelf at Game. Because this me, the me speaking to you now, didn't exist. I was a child. But I am aware the Fable marketing campaigns didn't temper fan expectations as much as they perhaps should have, and they have a bit of a reputation for that. But that, when it comes to Fable at the very least, doesn't affect my personal views, because I experienced this franchise backwards. As when Fable 1 released, it was 2004, and at that point I wasn't even sentient. I was probably too busy filling the toilet up with cement. And yes, that is a thing that I actually did as a child. I really couldn't tell you what I was doing in 2008, but I was 8, so probably not a lot. I'd like to think that you get the idea. If I can at all help it, this video is going to be relatively Peter Molyneux bashing free. But for those who are more present with the Fable franchise back then, I can understand and acknowledge the validity of expectation versus reality being a reasonable train of thought. And with all of that said, let's begin. So Fable 3 begins with a rather simple choice, choosing whether the protagonist is male or female. Though it's not really a character, it's just an insert for the player, though this time around the character is voiced. Don't go confusing that with a personality. We play as the younger sibling to the King of Albion, and we have a dog. And yes, it can be named. And whilst that may appear to be a sunshine and rainbows scenario, it's anything but, because your older brother, the King, Logan, is a lunatic. But fortunately we've been trained to arse-kicking quality by a man named Sir Walter Beck, just on the off chance that we might need to commit regicide, you know? It doesn't take long for our position at court to crumble beneath us, as we very quickly find ourselves openly opposing Logan's tyranny, because if there's one thing tyrants are known for, it's being reasonable. We're offered a choice that highlights the basis of the plot. We can either save the protesters who gathered outside the castle, or we can save Elise, who we're led to believe is the male protagonist version of an early love interest. However, we can only choose one, and Logan will kill who we choose not to spare. So we're either executing a character that we've known for 5 minutes, or characters we don't know at all. Does it affect the story after this point? No. But it's clear that Logan cannot be reasoned with. Thus, Albion needs a revolution. So we bust out of the castle with our tutor Walter and our butler Jasper, and of course our dog. And though we were more than happy to share a building with Logan not 10 minutes ago, now we're hell-bent on committing treason, alright. It's worth mentioning before we get any deeper that the plot does move very quickly because it's not an awfully long game, and I understand the idea that the intro is trying to portray. And for me, when I first played the game when I was a kid, it definitely hit the spot, but it's so fast-paced that it is somewhat erratic. But the premise does make sense. We need to start a revolution and overthrow the king because, for reasons unbeknownst to us, He's nuts. So that takes us to a dungeon beneath Bowerstone Castle's back garden, where we find our father's most prized possession, a guild seal. As it turns out, he was a hero, and in the Fable universe, heroes were mystical warriors that have extraordinary superhuman powers, and in order to bring Logan to his knees, we must become a hero too. That doesn't necessarily bind us to being morally upstanding. We can make good choices and bad choices, and the game doesn't do a bad job of putting us in a position where we've had to make one of each up until this point. Regardless, interacting with the Guild Seal transports us to this road to rule, where we are met by Teresa, the Seer of the Spire, who guided our father through his journey and is now here to do the same for us, albeit in a far less hands-on capacity. She's a glorified progress benchmark in this story. As for the road to rule, basically it's littered with chests inside which there are either abilities or upgrades to abilities that will aid us on our journey. Guild Seal gives us magical powers, proving that we are indeed a hero, and like any good hero would, we use that ability to mug off some bats. We also get a cool sanctuary that we can teleport to at any time, and that comes with a map so we can teleport to anywhere in Albion, once we've been there first, of course. The best word I can use to describe the sanctuary is a traversable pause menu. The specific functions are broken down into different rooms, and whilst I find the concept of this secret hub area chamber to be quite cool, it's not exactly intuitive. In fact, if you're trying to access something in a hurry in the middle of something, it can be quite a pain and it can take you out of the immersion, as in pressing the pause button you are transported to the sanctuary, greeted by Jasper, then you've got to move to the specific room that you need and find the item that you want. I didn't find it to be too terrible. I actually quite liked it for what it's worth, but it is an utter rigmarole. The map, on the other hand, is actually genuinely terrible. Simply put, the world design is built with fast travel in mind, and using the maps to navigate moving through the world is a bad idea, because when you go to specific locations, what the map shows you is actually so wildly inaccurate you cannot hope to navigate it, because where you're navigating versus what that map of the area looks like just aren't the same. The map also doesn't tell you where you are because you had to teleport to the sanctuary to use it, so at that point you might as well fast travel. As far as the story's concerned, our first stop is this dweller camp in the Mist Peak Mountains, as far away from Bowerstone as life gets. Unlike the industrial poverty of the city, the people up here appear to be nomadic, living in small trailers in the freezing cold, and Walter does a good job of filling us in on these people's individual struggles. I do like and appreciate Fable 3's environments and how every location has a unique identity and culture about it. Everything from people's clothing to the structures differ from location to location. Not without some overlap, but certainly enough for there to be a distinction. Walter sends us off to buy some clothes so we can blend in, even though the people that matter absolutely know who we are anyway. The game does trickle in the importance of morality by giving us the option to donate the remainder of the money to these impoverished people, but you can keep it for yourself with no consequences whatsoever. Fable games are built on their morality systems. You can be good or you can be evil, and usually there are consequences depending on which avenue you take. Some are favourable, some not so much, but there's always a consequence. But Fable 3 doesn't actually do very much with that. But we'll come back to that in more depth later. So we meet with the leader of the dwellers, a small man who's not wearing a shirt. It's fucking freezing, man, what are you doing? And his name is Sabine. He explains to us that the dwellers don't trust easy, so we're going to have to prove our worth if we want them as allies. He gives us some classic RPG objectives. We must prove we're a hero by accomplishing something that only a hero can do. We must also clear out some bandits from a nearby camp, and also get the neighbouring village of Brightwall to send aid, specifically sharing resources so the dwellers don't starve to death. I can appreciate that this is simply far more straightforward than it sounds. What I can appreciate about games from 10-15 years ago is that they aren't oversaturated with meaningless content that consists of wild goose chases all of the time or checklist objectives, typically speaking, which is a common problem with more modern RPGs. Now, there's nothing wrong with a good wild goose chase. What I find to be the case with regards to a lot of older games is that one objective will roll into the next. So instead of receiving 3 completely different quests for the 3 conditions of Sabine's allegiance, we just have to follow this golden path. It's along this path that we can discover the dog will sniff out treasure. He will find it with his nose because it emits a smell that catches his interest. I don't know how the dog is capable of this, but apparently he just is. Nice. Your dog sniffing out treasure does eventually lose value because it's not the quickest or the easiest way to actually amass wealth or resources for that matter. But early in the game it's a good way to get started. Anyway, it doesn't take us long to reach Brightwall because the world spaces are minuscule. But just like the Dweller Camp, the atmosphere is on point. Fable is very charming in how the environment aids the world building, and Fable 3 certainly doesn't deviate. It isn't huge, nor will you get lost in any one location, at least not for reasons that are good, but the actual world design serves a purpose and it serves it well. Our first stop is the Brightwall Academy.
Library is closed by order of the king. We don't serve drinks, we don't sell chicken feed. Please leave before the soldiers suspect you of gaining any real knowledge. Sweet papyrus!
So we must access a chamber only a guild seal can unlock the door to, thus proving that we are a hero, and then collect the contents within as proof. This is where we're introduced to the bulk of the combat system, specifically that of using blades or hammers, and also guns. We've already been introduced to the concept of using magic in combat, but this is where we first begin to actually explore combat rather than just killing a couple of wolves in passing. The game's combat system does work and I find it to be somewhat enjoyable, but I will say this: you can't die. There is no challenge. If you take too much damage, you'll simply be knocked out and you'll lose your progress towards your next guild seal, but you'll get back up just no problem whatsoever and continue fighting. Whilst I'm not fond of games having incredibly challenging combat, that's not for me, but I understand why it would be for some people, and I can understand the satisfaction in actually succeeding against those odds. But I also am not a fan of a combat system where there isn't any challenge whatsoever. It's just inviting button mashing, which is exactly what I do, so it suits me down to the ground. Fable 2 had a similar system, however there were consequences to being knocked out in combat, but I think the ability to die in combat is important because it gives game design a reason to actually balance the combat. Fable 3 is not terrible in this regard. There are only so many enemy archetypes really, but sometimes the fights are just a bit of a mess. So hopefully in the new Fable, taken on by an entirely different studio, we'll be able to die in battle, because then we as players will have to learn the system to get the most out of it, and by that I mean progression. If it's an obstacle that you're guaranteed to overcome, no matter how messily you approach it, it's not really an obstacle, it's just tedious. Why? Because there's no emphasis on giving a shit. After retrieving the music box per Sabine's request, this is where the game sort of opens up for you. So in my playthroughs, this is usually where I take off and start exploring one of the aspects outside of the story that I'd argue is perhaps the most important part of the game.
That's one hell of a pie.
Whilst I'm not talking about making pies specifically, though it is quite satisfying, I am talking about using the game's economy to your advantage. Though at no point before it's too late does the game tell you this, but if you don't pay attention to this mechanic, or should I say cluster of mechanics, the game will punish you severely. The game doesn't put enough emphasis on making money when it perhaps should. This system is perhaps Fable 3's greatest strength and weakness. Through doing jobs, you can make money, and you can upgrade your skills in these jobs in the Road to Rule, and as a result you can make more money faster. The main jobs are making pies by rolling out dough. I'm not entirely sure that's quite how it works, but okay. Playing a lute in a job referred to as Lute Hero, I wonder what that's referencing. And then of course a little later on there's blacksmithing as well. For the most part these jobs are the same thing but with a different coat of paint. They're QuickTime events where you have to press buttons in a pattern that lines up with the colours, and if you do well you increase your multiplier and make more money per round completed. However, if you cock up, the multiplier will go back to 1.
Oops, watch it!
The multiplier only goes up to 10, but you get the idea. You get some momentum going and you make some more dosh. And then from the Road to Rule, when spending guild seals, you can unlock the ability to purchase property. This is the important bit. Once you've made enough money, the most reliable way being doing jobs, you can buy houses, and then you can rent them out. You'll need to repair the houses every so often if they're being rented to tenants, because if the condition reaches 0%, they will refuse to pay you. You can, however, set the rate of rent between lowest and highest, lowest being free and highest being extortionate, and that will affect how people view you, which plays into the morality system. But you can do this to purchase more or less every single property in Albion regardless of whether or not somebody is living there already. They will never say no. In doing this, you generate a passive income that reliably pays you every 5 minutes. At first it's a slowish process, and with the money that you make from it you can purchase more property and increase how much you get paid every 5 minutes, and then supplement it in the meantime with jobs. Every so often rented properties will need to be maintained, so you will need to repair them over and over again, but they should at least pay for themselves before they do that. As you keep expanding your property empire, you will basically be promoted to Bill Gates, and that will give you the freedom to do what you love, burping in the faces of impoverished children. On top, you can also increase the value of properties by furnishing them in a specific order, but I don't think I actually did that once. And then later on in the game, as you progress through the road to rule, you can unlock the business side of this property empire of yours, meaning you can buy shops, drive the prices up, cause shortages in goods and inflation, and as a result grip Albion's economy thoroughly by the balls and ruin lives on an industrial scale. I'd make a joke about capitalism here, but I don't want America to rapidly approach my location. It's a long-winded process that inflates an otherwise short game's length to the power of fuck, but it does have significance that we'll have to wait until much later in the video to actually find out about. But next up in the story, we venture off to the mercenary camp where we must fight the mercenaries. Even though we're in disguise, they figure it out sooner or later. But if you don't mindlessly attack them because they're basically bandits, you'll get to experience some quality Fable humour. But anyway, we're here to face Saker, the leader of the mercenaries who have been causing problems up here in Mist Peak. Defeating him takes time. It isn't hard because, like I said, you can't actually die. You will do it, it's just a matter of when. In doing so, we get the option to spare his life and gain him as an ally, or kill him. Not that it matters either way, because he never shows up again regardless. But sparing his life means you can purchase the houses and shops in his camp and rent them out, so that's what we're doing. After all, if there was ever going to be a reason to spare a maniac's life, it was going to be profit, wasn't it? Leaving us with one final objective, convincing the people of Brightwall to help the people of the Dweller Camp. So now we've got to convince the people of Brightwall to believe in us too. And we can do this through acquiring guild seals, through doing side content, interacting with NPCs, or simply killing things. So this is where the game prompts us to go off and engage with the side content for a bit, and I must say, I am partial to a good Fable 3 side quest. Dressing up as a giant cock to enact psychological warfare against chickens is great, although slightly unhinged.
That's all of them. At last, the town can rest easy.
Oh, Bernard, you've got to lock them up again. This isn't right. They deserve to be free.
Now it's clear taking away their liberties isn't enough. I have to assume you'll try to facilitate another escape. And that means the only choice is to kill them all.
Then of course there's a quest where you're sent into Brightwall Academy to retrieve a haunted play, only for it to flop.
Great big giant bosoms!
What the hell was that?
Biggest load of old tosh I ever saw. It didn't even make sense.
Worst play ever.
And then of course you can help a man get a divorce by seducing his wife. The side content is charming, often unique, and Fable often has its sense of humour fully on display here. It's also nice that the story creates time for you to go off and do it and have it have a purpose. You're garnering support, and the best way to do that is to help people. It doesn't take long to garner enough guild seals to actually progress with the story, but the examples of side content being unique and interesting alone made me want to go off and do more. In amassing enough guild seals, the entire town of Brightwall is now 100% willing to commit treason against Logan and back your claim to the throne. However, we need to make a promise to the people of Brightwall, and that promise is to restore the Academy. As for the dwellers, they simply want you to return their lands to them. Sadly, you have to make the promises. There are no bad deals on paper Fable 3 could perhaps have benefited from some more dynamics in this respect. I feel as if a system in which you had to weigh up whether or not you could keep a promise before you made it would make for a more interesting system. It would have made for a more interesting take on the idea of finding allies, which makes up the main bulk of this portion of the game, if we as the player got some say as to who became our allies, or we could manipulate who would even want to be based on our actions, because the game seems to let us opt for one moral path or another, but when it comes down to the bare bones of the story, that doesn't alter an awful lot, if anything at all. Because I feel as if how you conduct yourself would certainly influence how these characters perceive you and how willing they are to lay down their lives for you. Of course there are going to be some staples for the sake of the story, and there are a couple of potential allies that you can fuck off altogether, but they will just vanish either way. There needed to be more decisions that could alter the storyline outside of whether or not you started buying into property as early as possible. And while a lot of the decisions that might make a difference occur later, in the front part of the story, gathering allies is rather linear. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but in my opinion, in order to properly complement a morality system, there needed to be more dynamics going on there. I think that lack of depth stems from the main narrative being shorter than initially desired. But whenever you find a new ally, there is a satisfying sense of accomplishment regardless, because usually after the fact you're transported back to the Road to Rule, where you get to link up with Teresa, who, like I said, is basically a glorified benchmark for progress in this game. And as a result, the journey swiftly continues. And with that said, it's time to crack on. Hopefully we'll be able to reach more prospective allies swiftly using this monorail.
It's about to move!
I guess not then. I guess this now means A, we've got to go and look for survivors, and B, we now have to traverse this cavernous cavern on foot. Sadly, there are no survivors, only hobs. Classic Fable monsters, and anybody who'd played Fable 1 and 2 before 3 was probably wondering when they'd show up. They're unthreatening individuals, but they come at you with numbers, so kill them all. To be fair, this segment is just a little bit of a slog. Perhaps one that could have been appreciated more if there was a prospect of the player character being able to die. As it stands, the only real challenge is how quickly can you get between A and B. And though they're more pesty creatures than anything else, you can't really have a Fable game without hobs.
I don't think you're going to find a way round this time. But I've got some magic of my own. Watch and learn. Boom!
At the other end of the cavern we arrive in a region called Mourningwood. I'm sure whoever came up with that had a good cackle, for it's here where we will find our next allies. A fort full of soldiers. We're introduced to two major characters here, Major Swift and Ben Finn, voiced by Simon Pegg. The soldiers let us play with a mortar for some reason. That is not a good idea. But jokes aside, I love when games introduce different mechanics to only use once in the main story. Granted, you can come back and do this in a minigame too, but it's fun when that's introduced as a one-off in the main story. It doesn't take long for the fort to come under attack by Hollow Men. They attack in numbers, but fortunately we have an endless supply of explosives on our side, meaning we're quite useful in dealing with the threat. But of course, they make their way inside the fort anyway. So we've got more fighting ahead of us. A character named Jammy gets killed, but we met him 2.5 minutes ago, but ultimately emerge victorious. Because of course we do. We can't die. And what do you know, re-killing a few skeletons is all it takes to convince this fortress full of soldiers to desert. So we promise to appoint Major Swift as leader of the Royal Army as soon as we're crowned, and then we crack on. By this point in the story, you're probably noticing that we haven't actually done anything too treacherous yet. We've just spoken about committing treason. But now we're off to the heart of Albion, the capital city, Bowerstone. Of course, we make a grand entrance by entering through Bowerstone Industrial Sewer. We're immediately taken aback by just how murky and dirty the streets are, and just how poor the people are. They're suffering under Logan's rule, under this drive of industry. The situation is dire, and civil unrest is brewing. So naturally I begin to add to the problems immediately. We happen upon a man inciting the crowd with cries of unfair treatment in the workplace, only for him to be brutally killed in broad daylight by a man named Reaver.
We're not gonna take it anymore. There's only one thing for it. We have to stand up to Reaver.
But lying down is so much easier than standing up. My dear friends, in order to raise morale, I'm offering prizes to the most deserving workers. The rules that will govern what I like to call the Reaver Team Spirit Award are these. Firstly, any worker that so much as murmurs another complaint will be shot. Secondly, any worker who takes more than a 3-second break will be shot. Thirdly, any worker who breaks any other rules I have yet to formulate will, yes, you guessed it, be shot.
Reaver is a bit of a complex antagonistic character. He was present in Fable 2, albeit much younger, but he basically embodies the oppression of the people. He's also the personification of Albion's economy. He also happens to be one of the more present villains, and whilst that isn't saying an awful lot, it makes you realise how underutilised most characters actually are when Fable 3 has a whopping cast. But anyway, we're here to meet the leader of the Resistance, Paige, who needs us to prove ourselves by, of course, you guessed it, doing side content. You need to gather 100 guild seals. It doesn't really matter how you'd go about it. You can do it several ways. Side content is just the most reliable. So of course I did the one thing that made sense.
That's a fine blade.
Of the jobs, blacksmithing is arguably the best for making money. Why? Because as you upgrade it, it doesn't get as complicated, and by that I mean Y doesn't become incorporated into the QuickTime event. So compared to making pies and playing the lute, this is the easiest of the jobs. If it's this easy to make stupid amounts of gold, why isn't everyone doing it? So I spent hours on end thoroughly abusing the in-game economy. And I had some excellent tactics for it as well. My main one was purchasing properties, then setting up my controller so there was always pressure on one of the sticks so it didn't look like I wasn't actually attending to the game, and then just let the money flow in. Every so often I'd check on how much I actually had, purchase more property comparative to what I could afford, and then I'd go again. And if I was really bored, I'd go off and make some pies, do some blacksmithing, shite to the loot, really just forget about it. And then when I was satisfied that I'd adequately laid waste to the economy, I started engaging with yet more side content. The game doesn't actually specify where you need to go and seek out the side quests, as all you need are 100 more guild seals to progress. So I returned to Brightwall. I created domestic issues, aided a man named Brian in bringing gnomes to life, which is a perfectly fine quest with no consequences, I promise. Just kidding, they turned evil and now there's 50 of them scattered across Albion, so no matter where we are or what we're doing, it will be overshadowed by a gnome insulting us.
Ha! You're funny, but looks aren't everything. I can't decide whether I like your looks or your personality better. It's like comparing mud to suet.
I also found myself involved in some quests in Bowerstone, such as somehow becoming involved in this clandestine Dungeons and Dragons game.
And all these bears will, well, they'll do evil stuff, for they are evil teddy bears.
Even as you find your way to the business end of Albion, the side content still finds a way to remain at least mostly unique, so I can appreciate that. The side quests of Fable 3 are absurd, and that's probably why they don't struggle to keep me engaged. But the main point at this stage in the game is to buy as much time as you can so that you can make as much money as possible, because it's important. But the game, again, hasn't disclosed that in any way whatsoever. This modest pile of money needs to become exceptionally large at rapid paces. Once we've amassed 100 guild seals either way, we can return to Paige to continue with the main quest line, where now we must don a ridiculous disguise and venture to Reaver's Manor, where we will aid Paige in rescuing some resistance guys, I guess. In case it wasn't obvious, which it was, it's a trap. So now we have to play Reaver's twisted game. Basically, over the course of a few rounds, he's going to be spinning the Wheel of Misfortune. And what that will do is then unlock a chamber which we have to go into and fight creatures that are specified on the wheel. So, yeah. It's several segments, all of which consist of long passages of combat. But there's no reason to be engaged in that besides from button mashing, because you can't die. But when we're king, I'm sure we'll find a way to execute Reaver brutally for what he's doing here. Not that it would have much effect, to be fair. But eventually, after what feels like an eternity of fighting, finally it's over. We can rescue Paige's man and abscond. And now Paige is convinced that we're a good guy, and as a result, we have the promise to change things for the people of Bowerstone. Not to worry, Paige, I promise to end the current exploitation of the people of Bowerstone and replace it with my own. Quick chinwag with Teresa, then Major Swift, one of our allies, gets killed by Logan. Peak. Anyway, we somehow manage to escape in a crowd of 13 people completely undetected and disappear back into the streets. But before we continue with the story, there is something we need to make come full circle. We meet up with a man named Laszlo in Bowerstone Industrial. Turns out, Laszlo's fiancée has been abducted by a band of criminals. Mint sounds like a job for a hero. So we aggressively slap up some criminals and confront their leader, Nigel Ferret. Turns out Laszlo's lover is down this hole.
Elise!
Well, that complicates things. I'm not entirely sure how we plan to explain this to Laszlo. It would appear as if I have accidentally gotten married. Oh dear. It could be worse. I could accidentally have children.
Remember when we used to sneak up to your room in the castle? Fancy reliving those memories?
Oh, yes!
I'm pregnant!
Oh, you've got to be This is my daughter, and her name is Dave.
Seeing you brings back memories of wanting my eyes gouged out.
It's a bit of a shame that if you spare Elise's life, it has no bearing on the main story, but instead she gets relegated to a side quest, and from there, a shallow NPC. Because it would have been nice if that early decision impacted the narrative in some way. Anyway, every 5 minutes I've now got to pay a family upkeep fee. But that's alright, I'll just make up for it by exploiting everybody. Having children is like subscribing to Twitter Blue. It's a mistake.
That's a nice doggy. If you like skinny little ugly runts.
With our wealth now hoarded to excessively ridiculous proportions, we can safely progress with the main story. The plan is quite simple. We're going to leave Albion, head for Aurora, blowing some stuff up along the way, and find some more allies there. This of course goes swimmingly until we get shelled by what I can presume is Logan's forces. As a result, we wash up alive somewhere remarkably warmer than wherever we were before. This of course is Aurora, or at least part of it. I can certainly give props to Fable 3's environmental diversity. This is vastly different to anywhere else. But before we can truly appreciate that, we have to head into some dark ruins inside a cave, where we discover the true main antagonist of the game.
The light you bring will die. The light inside you will die. All that you are will die.
Who's there? Show yourself. Well, this isn't good.
The children are here to play.
A sinister entity known only as the Crawler appears to command the darkness, enacts psychological attacks against us and Walter. We barely manage to escape with our lives. However, Walter is left blinded, and we are weakened. However, the Auroran people help us. In return for their help and their loyalty, all they ask is that we promise to rebuild Aurora and protect its people. It's a reasonable deal, and with that friendship drawn, we are now ready to take the fight directly to Logan himself. This segment cuts you off a bit from Albion so you can't return, so it perhaps aids itself in not being especially long, but at the same time I can't help but feel as if this segment was lacking in the sense that you arrive at Aurora, you make your allies very quickly when you find them, and then you sort of go. And whilst it was good to have this sort of psychological attack from the crawler and the darkness, it would have been really nice to expand on that and truly realise this threat and its impact on the nation and not just on you as an individual passing through it before returning to Albion. But alas, that's exactly what we're doing. Whilst Walter does recover his sight, he is permanently impacted by his experience here, and that's an interesting idea to play with. Perhaps they didn't play with it enough, but the point got across, and now it's time to go and snatch Albion from the grasp of Michael Fassbender. The battle is fairly swift, and the dickhead didn't even put up a fight, which is both disappointing and sick at the same time, because now we've officially usurped Logan and become the monarch. We get an assistant named Hobson who's basically just Jasper but morally bankrupt, and our first royal duty is to decide the fate of our brother. We can either pardon him or execute him. If we pardon him, we can use his soldiers in the fight to come. As it turns out, he was only a tyrant because he was doing what was necessary to protect Albion from the darkness. But we can afford to be a benevolent ruler because we invested in real estate. Then Teresa has a chat with us in which she reveals that the darkness is coming to Albion and we have exactly 365 days, yes, 1 year to prepare. We can either be benevolent and as a result bankrupt the country based on the reserves it has for itself, or we can be a tyrant and prepare the country properly for what's coming. So if you didn't invest in the game's economy up until this point, this is where you get punished. Because you have to break every single promise made, or you simply have to be benevolent and then not prepare in the slightest. But because I've been sucking the life force out of the country before I rose to power, I can just donate into the treasury myself and solve that problem. And now we're kings, so we get a big segment of the game where we get to make decisions regarding important matters that affect the entire nation. Often this will consist of a character we've made a promise to, proposing a means for actually meeting that promise, only for it to be contested every time by Reaver of all people. Why are we even keeping him around? I actually don't understand that. Now look, Reaver's counter-offers are naturally the more financially sustaining option, so if you don't mind breaking every single promise you've ever made in this game ever, then I guess it might make sense. But if you've invested in property, then you have no reason to even entertain him. How this game goes about addressing whether or not you're going to live up to the promises you've made is a very one-dimensional system. Financially speaking, keeping your promises is always the unfavourable option, and it's always an ally of yours versus your enemy. On your first playthrough, no doubt this may catch a lot of players completely off guard, as they're either condemning Albion to ruin or breaking every single promise. But if you know the score and invest into the property system from very early on and then make stupid amounts and then invest a load of it into the treasury, you don't have to worry about whatever Reaver has to say. So that makes making decisions incredibly easy because there's no reason for it to be complicated. Perhaps a better system would have been one in which there was conflicts between the interests of one party that you made promises to versus another, and then you're forced to break a promise to keep a promise, or something along those lines, but that never happens. So in that respect, Fable 3 does fail to simulate the hardships of being a ruler, because it can simply be very easily undermined by making pies. Even though I do love Fable 3, this is my least favourite part of the game, for not just this reason, but this is certainly the big one. I understand not overcomplicating the fictional politics of a silly Monty Python-inspired world, but not adding complexity, depth and layers to the decisions we get to make as king is honestly quite underwhelming. There are decisions to make outside of the promises we made. For example, we can set the tax rate, we can choose to impose a fine on people who have children, and things like that, but nothing even made me sweat. It was all just very easy because I knew I had the funds to replenish the treasury. Sometimes the implications of a choice need to go beyond how hard it hits your finances, and sadly those dilemmas are simply not present. Why the fuck is my dog floating? The other thing I find to be a bit odd with this segment is it says that you have 365 days until the darkness attacks, but there are lots of time jumps, one's even in excess of 100 days. So unless you actively make time by removing yourself from the fast-paced environment, the game's true ending is going to sneak attack you. This is where I typically mooch off and do a touch of side content that I'm yet to mention. Demon doors. They're doors to which you need to fulfill specific requests in order to access the contents within. Some simply want to meet a monarch like this one, and then you'll mooch inside the demon door and find your reward. For example, a chest containing 1 million gold is incredibly useful. Others are a bit useless, but you know, at this point in your progression, the vast majority of demon doors are either going to be available, or the requests won't be too challenging to fulfill. And though sometimes the rewards are underwhelming, you simply cannot have a Fable game without demon doors. Returning to the story, the fast-paced nature of this king bit is more or less in step with the rest of Fable 3. It's a very quick story, and your only objective is ensuring you have at least 6.5 million gold in the treasury before this portion of the story ends. And you have less time than you think, so being aware that this is going to happen well before you even become king, though impossible on a first playthrough, is a necessity. And sure enough, on the 1-year anniversary of your reign, the darkness will fall on Albion.
It's here. The darkness has reached Bowerstone. Reports indicate that our defenses were able to hold off the worst of the first attack. But if we don't act quickly, even the armies we prepared for this day will not be enough.
We have to get out on the streets, now!
Today we fight for Albion!
For Albion!
Here's a thought, why did we wait for the darkness to come to Bowerstone? Why didn't we take the fight to the darkness? It's not like we didn't know where to find it. So now we take to the streets of Bowerstone, fighting shadows. Again, there's no real challenge here because we can't die. The battle doesn't take long and ends with Walter becoming possessed by the crawler. So in order to save Albion, we must kill Walter.
I'm sorry.
You took away the darkness. It's been inside me all this time. But it's light now. I can see the sky. And it's light. I don't think I can fight anymore.
It's all over, Walter. We won. We beat it together.
Do you remember the stories I tell you when you were a child? There was a great king once. The mightiest hero of them all. Remember what you would say?
Teach me to be a hero.
You've done me proud, boy. You've always done me proud.
Oh, Walter.
Walter's death did indeed make me sad. It was a good character, and it was a fitting end, and it was good to have a sacrifice that had some weight to it. But the main takeaway is Albion is now saved. We managed to save everyone, besides from Walter of course, but he's here in a statue now, so he won't be too bothered. Teresa arrives to tell us that we've saved Albion from darkness, and we managed to do so whilst also being a benevolent ruler whom the people love. Unless you have the funds to back it up, being benevolent only results in everyone in Albion dying, and the consequences of that are you have to explore an open world completely devoid of NPCs aside from guards and quest givers. However, I did notice that playing co-op actually resolved that problem. I could have gone the easier route and become a tyrant, but I didn't because I had the money I used through exploiting the people in the property market. But the morality doesn't impact the ending whatsoever. It simply boiled down to whether or not you could afford righteousness. And now the credits are rolling, and we've finished Fable 3. Coming out of this playthrough, I must say that I love Fable 3 even still, but look, I can also agree that it is flawed beyond belief. The narrative covers an awful lot of story in a very condensed amount of time, overlooked for the sake of moving on to the next thing. A lot of the mechanics were far more surface level than they perhaps should have been. Not being able to die in combat meant it was quite vapid and meaningless, as there was no challenge. But at the same time, to me, the content that was there was lots of fun. Fable's sense of humour never misses, and the environments and atmosphere are on point. In my opinion, the idea of the greatness is there for all to see, but the execution just wasn't to that same level. I reckon Playground Games' Fable could do a lot with the ideas of the Lionhead Studios games, and that includes incorporating some of the ideas from Fable 3, but at the same time realising depth, and hopefully in rebooting this franchise they can start realising the potential of the Fable brand and truly take it to the next level where it belongs. But we know the landscape of modern games, so I 100% understand if people have their reservations, because I know I do too. Thanks for watching, I'll see you soon.
I've said it before and I'll say it again, I hate you.